The spring sun dipped behind the hills, casting long, jagged shadows across the stone floor of the palace rooftop. King David stood at the edge, looking out over a city that had finally gone quiet. The evening air was still, carrying the scent of dry earth. He turned his gaze toward a garden wall nearby, his eyes catching movement in the courtyard below. A woman was there. She was bathing, unaware of the eyes fixed upon her from the heights. David did not turn away. He gripped the stone railing, his knuckles whitening as he watched. The silence of the rooftop felt heavy. He could have walked back into his chambers. He could have called for wine or music. Instead, he stayed. He watched until the choice solidified in his chest. He turned his back on the city and beckoned his servants. He sent them to the garden to bring the woman to him. In that moment, the king traded his integrity for a fleeting desire. The weeks that followed were marked by a suffocating silence. David moved through his palace with a forced calm, attending to state affairs while his mind remained anchored to the garden. He believed the matter was buried, a secret kept behind thick walls and loyal servants. Then, the morning arrived that shattered his composure. A messenger stood in the throne room, his head bowed, holding a scroll sealed with wax. David took the message, his fingers brushing the parchment. He read the words once, then twice. The blood drained from his face as the reality settled into his gut. She was pregnant. The king sat back on his throne, the heavy wood pressing against his spine. The city outside seemed suddenly loud, the sounds of the marketplace drifting through the open windows like a judgment. If the news reached the public, his reputation would crumble. He turned toward the chamber doors, ready to summon the one man who could fix his mistake. Uriah arrived at the palace, his presence bringing the grit and exhaustion of the front lines into the polished halls of the king. David greeted him with forced warmth, pouring wine and speaking of the war with a casual tone that masked his true intent. He urged the soldier to return home, to rest, to be with his wife. It was a calculated trap designed to hide the coming scandal. But Uriah did not move toward the door. He stood firm, his gaze fixed on the king with a clarity that made David shift in his seat. The soldier spoke of his brothers in the field, of the Ark of the Covenant resting in a tent, and of the impossibility of seeking comfort. He refused to step foot in his own house. David watched him, his own pulse quickening with a mix of irritation and fear. David pressed, offering more wine, trying to force a compliance. Uriah remained unmoved, his devotion acting as a mirror to David's cowardice. The king realized his manipulation had failed. The soldier walked away, leaving David alone in the quiet chamber, his desperation turning lethal. The chamber was silent, save for the scratching of a quill against parchment. David sat at his desk, the inkwell reflecting the dim light of a single flickering lamp. He dipped the quill, his fingers steadying as he began to draft the message that would end a life. The words were precise, cold, and final. He commanded his commander to position Uriah at the very front of the fiercest fighting, where the blades were thickest and the arrows rained down like hail. Then, he wrote the instruction to pull back, to leave the soldier isolated and exposed to the enemy. He paused, the quill hovering over the page, for a heartbeat. The weight of the betrayal pressed against his chest. He looked at the ink, dark and permanent, and then he finished the sentence. He folded the parchment, his movements mechanical, and pressed his signet ring into the hot wax. The seal clicked into place, a mark of authority turned into a death warrant. He stood up and walked to the door, calling for his messenger. David handed it over, his voice steady, his eyes devoid of the warmth he had shown only hours before. As the messenger turned to leave, the king watched him go, the finality of his choice settling into the room. The secret would be buried in the dust of the battlefield. The battlefield roared with the clash of iron and the screams of dying men. Under the commander's orders, the formation shifted, pulling back in a coordinated retreat that left a single gap in the line. Uriah stood at the center of that gap, his shield raised, his blade swinging in a desperate arc against the surging enemy. He looked back, expecting the support of his brothers, but saw only the retreating backs of his own army. The trap had snapped shut. Arrows whistled through the air, finding their mark in the exposed flank. He took a blow to the shoulder, then another to the leg, forcing him to one knee. He fought on, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes searching the horizon for a relief that would never come. A final wave of steel crashed over him, and he fell into the churned, blood-soaked earth. Silence followed, save for the distant thrum of the retreating army. Days later, the news reached the palace. A messenger knelt before the king, his voice low as he reported the loss of the soldier. David nodded, his face a mask of practiced sorrow. He dismissed the man, walked to the window, and watched the sun dip behind the hills. He felt the cold relief of a man who believed he had outrun his own shadow. The throne room doors groaned open. Nathan walked the length of the hall, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor. He stopped before the king, his gaze steady. He began to speak, not of kings or wars, but of a rich man with vast flocks and a poor neighbor, who possessed only one small, beloved lamb. The prophet described how the rich man, refusing to touch his own abundance, stole the poor man's single treasure to feed a traveler. David shifted on his throne, his jaw tightening. He listened as the story reached its bitter end. The king stood up, his face flushing with a deep, hot crimson. He slammed his fist against the armrest, his voice booming through the chamber. "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die." David paced, his chest heaving with indignation, his eyes burning with a self-righteous fire. He demanded justice, his words sharp and unforgiving. Nathan did not flinch. He waited for the king to finish, then stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The prophet looked him directly in the eye, his voice dropping to a low, piercing calm. "You are that man." The air left the room. David froze, his hand still gripped in a fist. The crown slipped from his head, clattering against the stone floor with a hollow, final sound. David fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he gripped the cold edge of the dais. He did not call for his guards. He did not reach for his sword. He whispered a single, broken confession into the stillness of the room. But the mercy he sought was not immediate. Outside, the city began to churn. The news of his betrayal had spread like wildfire, and the people turned against him. Absalom, his own son, rose at the head of a growing army, his banners snapping in the wind outside the palace gates. The king had no time to mourn his lost integrity. He was forced to leave his home, not as a ruler, but as a fugitive. He reached the city gate and stepped out onto the dusty path leading toward the Mount of Olives. He walked barefoot, the sharp stones biting into his skin. He looked back once at the walls of his city, then turned his face toward the wilderness, stripped of his pride, his crown, and his peace. The wilderness offered no shelter, only the biting wind and the vast, indifferent expanse of rock. David sat on a jagged ledge, his breath hitching in the thin, cold air. He reached into his pack and pulled out the harp. The wood was weathered, the strings frayed from years of neglect. He ran his fingers over the frame, feeling the rough grain, then began to tighten the pegs. The sound of a single, vibrating string cut through the silence. He did not play the anthems of his youth, nor the songs of his victories against giants. His hands moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, plucking notes that hung in the stagnant air like questions. He spoke the words aloud, his voice raspy and stripped of its former command. He sang of his own brokenness, of the darkness he had cultivated in his own soul. He did not ask for his throne back. He did not ask for the rebellion to end. He asked for a clean heart. He asked for a spirit that could withstand the truth of his own failures. The music became a rhythm of confession, a steady, pulsing beat that mirrored the thumping of his own heart. He sat there for hours, sun dipping below the horizon, his fingers calloused and raw. He was no longer a king leading armies. He was a man, alone with his conscience, learning that the hardest battle was not fought with a sword, but with the quiet, agonizing work of repentance. The wilderness had stripped away the last remnants of his arrogance. David stood at the edge of the valley, looking back at the path he had walked. His hands were calloused, his face weathered by the relentless sun, and his eyes held a clarity they had lacked in the palace. He turned toward the city. He did not march. He walked with a steady, measured pace, his feet finding the familiar stones of the road. As the gates of Jerusalem came into view, he did not call for his guards or demand his throne. He approached the entrance as a traveler, his head held high but his heart open to whatever judgment awaited him. The people at the gate watched him pass, their silence heavy. He did not look away. He walked through the archway, the shadows of the city falling across his path, and he felt the weight of his past finally lift. He had fought the greatest battle of his life, not against a giant, not against an army, but against the darkness he had nurtured in his own soul. He reached the center of the city, stopping in the square where he had once issued orders that led to death. Now, he stood in the light of a new day, a man redeemed by grace. He had lost his pride, his crown, and his peace, but he had found something deeper, a spirit that knew the cost of his choices and the absolute necessity of mercy. He was home, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had finally learned how to live.